Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my PyCon talk. We got a real packed room here, just me and my cat. My name is Shauna Gordon-McKeon and I have been a member of the Python community for about 10 years now. This would have been my 8th PyCon, I think. I am a programmer, a project manager, a community manager, and today I'm going to be talking to you about organizing your workplace. So I submitted this talk to be a how-to, a chance for you to learn about what rights protect you as workers and what tools you have available to you when organizing your workplace. But before I get into the how, I want to talk about the why. Why would tech workers organize? Why would tech workers need a union? Don't we have it good enough already? You've probably heard this sentiment expressed before. Maybe you've even thought it yourself, and it's a valid question. I don't know about you, but for me, whenever I think about workers being exploited, one of the images that leaps to mind is of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which was a shirtwaist factory back in the earlier part of the 20th century, where they used to lock their workers inside the factory, which was bad enough on a regular day, but one day a fire broke out and hundreds of people died. They couldn't get out of the building. Some of them died jumping from the higher floors. Another image that sometimes leaps to mind for me is the Ludlow Massacre, which is where coal companies called out the Colorado National Guard who fired into a camp of striking workers, killing dozens, including some of the children of the striking workers. Or maybe I think about the many mining accidents and disasters there have been, or the black lung that coal mining companies expose their workers to. And of course, this isn't just a problem of the past. Millions of people around the globe today are experiencing forced labor or labor exploitation, and they face violent retribution for any organizing that they might undertake. And so you're probably thinking, tech workers have it pretty easy compared to this, don't we? Like, our employers hardly ever kill us. Shouldn't we just kind of shut up and be grateful? And I have 3 responses to that. First, just because a greater harm exists in the world or existed at some other point in time doesn't mean that a given problem isn't still real and harmful and worth addressing. Second, it was workers and labor activists who fought and sometimes gave their lives in these battles that gave us the rights and the precedents that we have today. And we honor their memories by exercising those rights and following those traditions, not by ignoring them. Third, when we address lesser harms proactively, we prevent them from spiraling into greater harms. And we also build the relationships and the skills and the strength to address any greater harms that come up in the future. But this is all kind of abstract and would apply to any relatively well-off worker in modern society. So I want to talk about why tech workers specifically might want to organize. So for all the talk of tech workers having it good, there are some problems that routinely crop up in our workplaces. So as in many other industries, there's a pay gap between what white men make and what other people make, what people of color and what women make. For instance, one report found that in 60% of cases, women were being offered lower compensation for the same roles at the same companies. In the tech industry, Black women still make 89 cents on the dollar that white men do. Many workers also face discrimination on the job. One report found that 60% of women in tech in Silicon Valley experienced sexual harassment, with 2/3 of that harassment coming from their superiors. 1 in 3 reported being afraid for their personal safety, because of work-related circumstances. People of color, and in particular Black, Latino, and Native people, continue to be drastically underrepresented in tech. People of color who do work in tech face racial discrimination, from being passed over for promotions and to being accosted by security guards who don't believe they work in the places they work. And this is just scratching the surface of the many different kinds of discrimination and harassment that workers in tech face. I have included some links to learn more about these kinds of things at the end of the talk. So this varies greatly by company, but many tech workers are pushed to work very long hours. One survey found that more than half of tech workers work over 40 hours a week, with nearly a fifth working 60 hours a week or more. And I find this overtime issue particularly sad because it reminds me of the 1840s when the Mill Girls of Lowell led one of the nation's very first strikes, demanding, among other things, a 10-hour workday. And here we are 170 years later, and we're still fighting for it. Another issue that tech workers are asked is that Another issue is that tech workers are asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. The nominal reason for NDAs is to protect companies from their former or current employees disclosing proprietary information, but this is actually protected against via trade secret law. And so instead, NDAs are actually being used to prevent employees from discussing problems with the company outside of the company. So one survey found that 15% of tech workers felt silenced by the NDAs they'd sign, with workers at Tesla, Intel, and Amazon being the most likely to feel silenced. Another issue is that many tech workers, when they're hired, are pressured to sign forced arbitration agreements. When you sign one of these agreements, you essentially sign away your right to sue in court. Instead, you have to submit to arbitration, which is a private third-party company, and it's much more likely to find in favor of the employer than courts do. Forced arbitration agreements can apply to you if you're suing for sexual harassment or workplace discrimination or wrongful termination, many other issues. And most tech companies require employees to sign arbitration agreements, although Google workers have successfully pressured Google into stop doing so, which is great. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the talk. So more than half of workers in the tech industry are contractors rather than full-time employees. For instance, as of March 2019, Google employed 121,000 temps and contractors compared with 102,000 full-time employees, so more temps and contractors than full-time employees. And these workers are often misclassified. This is particularly galling to me, however you pronounce that. It's a problem to me as I am an actual independent contractor in that I work with clients and they will offer me money to achieve certain goals, but I decide how to meet the goals, what hours I work, when I work, what I do, what the fees are. That's what an independent contractor really does. Instead, usually Google and these other tech companies are misclassifying contractors because they don't want to have to pay their health benefits, they don't want to have to give them overtime pay, and various other things. And typically this mistreatment pervades the workplace. It's not just like a technical issue of how much they're being paid, it is part of how they're treated at a fundamental level. So for instance, some contractors, their bathroom breaks are monitored. At Facebook, they've got like tens of thousands of content moderators who are contractors, and they've been developing PTSD from the lack of support they get during their exposure to this hateful content that they're moderating. And of course, like other workers, they're required to sign NDAs that prevent them from sharing the conditions of their workplace to the wider world. In short, our employers do what they think they can get away with. They would do worse to us if they thought they could get away with worse. You can see that in how they treat contractors, but also in how they treat other kinds of employees. A full-time software developer at Amazon is treated very differently than a warehouse worker who's paid like $15 an hour and has their bathroom breaks monitored. And in areas of the tech industry with greater numbers of workers, such as the game industry, workers are treated more poorly because companies know that if one worker quits due to the way they're being treated, it'll be easier to find someone to take their place. The game industry is famous for its crunch culture, with workers regularly pushed to work 50, 70, even 100-hour weeks, often without overtime pay. The only thing that separates well-paid tech workers from exploited tech workers and exploited other workers is supply and demand. Right now, our skills are in short supply, but it won't be that way forever. And then the problems we face will grow much worse. While there are a number of problems in our workplaces, they're not the only reason that we might decide to organize. The work we do has an impact on the world around us, and we have some responsibility for that impact. We can't just say, oh, that's the boss's decision, that's the CEO's decision, that's not on me, because it's our labor and our efforts that make the boss's decisions come true, that carry it out. And so when they decide to do something that hurts others for the sake of profit, that's on us as well. But we're not helpless. The flip side of responsibility is power, as Spider-Man likes to remind us, and we have the power to change things. And we have some great role models in this regard. America's teachers have pioneered, or among those who pioneered, the use of organizing for the common good. So when Seattle school teachers went on strike in 2015, for instance, they didn't just win things like raises. They also demanded and won guaranteed recess for all their students, as well as they got a committee to look into disciplinary measures that were being disproportionately impactful on minority students. In Chicago, teachers demanded a nurse in every school, as well as staff hired specifically to help students who were homeless or at risk of being homeless. And it's not just teachers who are putting themselves out there for their communities. Bank workers have come together to push Wells Fargo to stop tying employee pay to the use of predatory lending techniques. And just a few weeks ago, workers in General Electric started organizing to get the company to use their idle factories to create vital, life-saving ventilators. What kind of changes could tech workers make if we organized for the common good? Well, there are so many issues in the tech industry that I could not possibly list them all here, but I just want to go over like some of the big ones, the ones that really stick out for me. Many tech companies have adopted business models that require them to aggressively violate the privacy of their users, or even people who aren't their users but who interact with their users. They gather data with limited or no consent, and then sometimes they offer it up to third parties. And Facebook is the obvious big name here, but they're not the only company that's doing this. Some companies are actively working on applying tools of surveillance and monitoring to oppressed communities. Amazon's Ring has partnered with hundreds of police forces across the country to provide surveillance data on communities. And given the disproportionate policing of communities of color and the disproportionate use of police brutality towards communities of color, I think it's not a leap to say that Amazon is contributing directly to violent systemic racism. Then, of course, there's companies like Palantir who are working directly with agencies like ICE and CBP to track down, seize, and deport immigrants and separate their families. Just a reminder that there have been multiple deaths of immigrants in ICE/CBP custody, including the deaths of at least half a dozen children. The big social media platforms have long had problems with hate speech and misinformation that they've hesitated to address. In possibly the worst case, Facebook let its platform be used to fan the flames of a genocide in Myanmar, where over 25,000 Rohingya Muslims were killed and more than 500,000 forced to flee their homes. Facebook refused to ban the groups that were carrying out this genocide from Facebook for more than a year. This is one of the worst cases, probably the worst case of social media being used to incite violence and hatred, but it is hardly the only one, and it will keep being a problem unless we do something. Social media platforms have also contributed to the rise of misinformation, both by failing to address misinformation being spread on their platforms and also by starving the news industry of income so that it's harder to generate news from trusted sources. Facebook has been particularly at fault here, as it swallowed a huge percent of journalism revenue, as well as lying to newspaper outlets about the reach they'd have on Facebook through things like video. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the way that many tech companies are failing to protect their workers from exposure to COVID-19. This is largely an issue for tech companies that have workers that are contract with or employ essential workers. So Amazon, Instacart, Lyft, Uber. These workers are getting sick and dying while the companies that pay them fail to protect them from the virus. And sometimes they're not even communicating when they're at risk. Now, Amazon and Instacart workers are going on strike, and I urge tech workers to step up and support them with our resources, our money, and our voices. Be aware, though, that stepping up does have some risks. 2 tech workers at Amazon, Emily Cunningham and Marin Costa, were fired just within the last couple of weeks for offering to match donations to striking warehouse workers and for tweeting that Amazon needed to do more to protect them. Okay, so hopefully at this point I have convinced you that tech workers ought to organize. So let's switch gears to talking about how. What tools and traditions exist? What laws and regulations protect us? Let me start off by clarifying. Your right to organize is not limited to forming a union. Union organizing is just one kind of what's called a protected concerted activity. A protected concerted activity is any activity undertaken by 2 or more employees to improve the terms and conditions of their employment. So this is a right that all of us have across the US, regardless of state laws surrounding organizing and regardless of anything you signed with your employer. If you and 1 or more other coworkers discuss or take action to improve your workplace, your employer cannot fire you for it. Although, of course, they could pretend that they were firing you for some other reason. So you might have seen the case recently of Chris Smalls, the Amazon warehouse worker who was fired after leading a strike demanding protections from Amazon against COVID-19 exposure. So Amazon claims that they fired Smalls because he violated social distancing guidelines, and whether or not he did, this is not just to defend themselves in the court of public opinion. It would be illegal for them to fire him for leading a strike, so they have to come up with some other pretext. Like, no matter what they would be saying, there was some other reason. Another high-profile example of a protected concerted activity is the Google walkout. So for those who don't remember, back in 2018, over 20,000 Google workers walked out to protest the way that Google had handled sexual harassment cases, as well as some other grievances. It was really exciting, but you don't need to have 20,000 other people to be part of a concerted activity. You just need one other person. A side note here is that whistleblowing is not always a concerted activity, because whistleblowing can be done by an individual acting alone. But nevertheless, if you are a whistleblower, you are protected by separate laws. Any individual disclosing information which they reasonably believe evidences a violation of the law, a gross waste of funds or abuse of authority, or a substantial danger to health and public safety is protected from retaliation. But let's say that you do specifically want to form a union. How would you go about it? What is involved in forming a union? Really, step 0 is reach out to an existing union or organizer who can give you advice about going through this process. But then step 1 is talking to your coworkers. So if you want to form a union, there's a chance that there's something about your workplace or the impact of your work on the world that is bothering you. So talk to your coworkers and see if anything is bothering them. What are the common grievances that you all seem to have? And not everyone has to have exactly the same grievances, but you want to focus on the things that there's consensus about and everyone's worried about and everyone's concerned about. Most people try to keep things secret from their employer at this stage. While your activity is legally protected as soon as you start talking to another person, often it's not worth the risk of your employer being tipped off early, because they will proactively try to stop you, and the earlier they find out, the more advance warning they get. So step 2 is building an organizing committee. When you're talking to other workers, some will be interested in working with you to form a union, and together you can create an organizing committee. The committee should eventually grow to be about 10% of the workforce. This level of participation is both just a good sign for support for the union in general, but it also helps your organizing committee to be more representative of workers as a whole, rather than the small clique that's not really accountable to all of the workers. The next step is generating majority support. Once you've got a strong organizing committee, it's time to go public, and your goal now is to get majority support so that you can win a union election. During this phase, employers will likely begin an anti-union effort if they hadn't found out about your work before. So they may do things like hold captive audience meetings, and that's when workers are forced to sit and listen to the boss talk about why the union would be terrible for them. They might get supervisors or upper management that's particularly well-liked to speak out against the union, and that may or may not be the well-liked person's actual opinion. They may be pressured into doing it. They'll often hire out union-busting firms to carry these tactics out. Employers spend about $340 million annually on union avoidance, and in over 40% of union elections, they are charged with violating labor law. So they will fight. There's other things they might do, like illegal retaliation, and we'll get to retaliation in just a minute. So because employers' anti-union efforts will likely convince some of your coworkers to vote against the union, whether that's through genuinely changing their minds or just through scaring them, but because the anti-union efforts will peel away some support, you actually want to get to more than majority support before you move into the next step. So many unions will advise getting to about 60 or 65% support. But once you get there, it's time for step 4, holding an election. So as you generate support for your union, you're going to be circulating something called a union authorization card. When an employee signs a card, they're signaling that they're interested in being represented by a union. Once enough people have signed these cards, they'll be submitted to the relevant government agency, usually the National Labor Relations Board. Your employer should never see these cards or know who signed them. At this point, the employer may choose to forgo an election and just recognize the union. If that's so, they'll do something that's called card check, and that's when a mutually agreed upon third party goes through and checks each authorization card and makes sure it's an authentic signature and that the person who signed it really does want a union. If a majority of workers' cards are authenticated through this process, then the union is acknowledged and you have a union, yay. More often, in most cases, the employer will require an election to take place before they recognize the union. An election will be held via secret ballot, either at the job site or through the mail. And if the union wins the majority, then the employer is forced by law to recognize them. The final step is negotiating a contract. The union will elect or appoint a bargaining committee who negotiate a contract with the employer. But in order for that contract to be adopted, the union members, all of them, must ratify it via a majority vote via secret ballot. No one, not the union, not the employer, will know how an individual member voted on ratification of the contract. If the union members don't ratify the contract, if there's not majority support, the union and the employer return to the bargaining table, and this repeats as many times as is necessary until there's a contract that the majority of workers sign. So the union never forces a contract on its members. The members must ratify it. One of the biggest concerns when workers are organizing is employer retaliation. Employers are not legally allowed to retaliate against us for participating in concerted activity, whether that's organizing a union or circulating a petition or just getting together with a coworker over coffee to complain about how much you hate the open office floor plan. But not legally allowed to do it and not actually doing it are two separate things. Kickstarter fired two of the main organizers of Kickstarter United, and Google has fired, demoted, changed the rules of several of the organizers of the Google walkout. So Google and Kickstarter and these other companies may be betting that they can get away with illegal retaliation. Labor disputes are settled by the National Labor Relations Board, which is a 5-person board appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. As you can imagine, with the Republican Senate and with Trump as president, the board has become very conservative, and so companies may be right that they can get away with these illegal behaviors and that the NLRB will turn a blind eye to it. However, all is not lost. There are things that we can do to protect against retaliation, some of which go back to a time before the NLRB existed and before these other protections existed. We can donate it to a fund to help protect people who are struggling financially after being retaliated against. We can create a network to help people get hired in new places. Oftentimes when people are retaliated against, their sort of reputation suffers. They'll have negative performance reviews or get blackballed from promotions. So we can take care to lift these people up, give them new opportunities, help them keep their profile in the community, and just generally offering them emotional, social, legal, financial, logistical support. The most important thing we can do, though, is to build strength in numbers. In 2017, there was a wave of strikes in schools across the country. Teachers in 9 different states walked out of their classrooms. And most of these were illegal strikes because in many states it is illegal to strike as a public employee. And so any one of these teachers could have been fired, but they weren't, because what are you going to do, fire 20,000 teachers? So the reason tech workers are paid so well on average is because there is a greater demand for the work that we do than people who can supply it. Not because what we do is so important to society, and not because our bosses really like us and want us to be happy. It's because they need us, and that means that we have power. We can protect against retaliation by coming together in larger numbers. I reached out to a friend recently to participate in a solidarity action, and he was hesitant because he said, "I've always seen myself as more of an executive than a worker." And I want to take a moment to unpack that because I don't think it's that unusual. Tech has a very specific kind of culture, and many people with a specific kind of self-image are drawn into that culture. And I count myself as one of these people. I like thinking of myself as independent and ambitious and creative and someone who works autonomously and has control and direction over the things that I do. But I wonder why we see unions as more restrictive than companies. With a union, we have a real say in what gets decided. We elect our union leadership and our union representatives, and we vote to ratify bargaining agreements. With our employers, we have no say whatsoever. We don't have any independence. We just, whatever they say goes. So why does the dictatorship, essentially, of a traditional corporate form feel less restrictive than the democracy of a union? Is it because the power structures of the traditional corporate form are so normal to us and so common to us that they've become invisible? Other friends have said to me, "Look, I just want to work at work. I don't want to bring politics into it." It reminds me actually of the single responsibility principle. For those of you who don't know, this is the idea that each part of a code base, each module or class, should have responsibility for a single piece of functionality. And all of the logic for it should be encapsulated within that class, so that the class doesn't have to worry about anything else that any other class is doing, just what's going on in its own space. And that's a seductive idea that you could apply that to people, but people don't work like that. And frankly, software seldom works like that. How many projects do you know of that actually successfully encapsulate functionality within individual classes? Most don't. Most are full of leaky abstractions. And a leaky abstraction is when you think that you've hidden all of the messy stuff behind a nice, abstract, clean interface, but then you go ahead and you use it in the real world, and all of the complications just leak out. So you may think, my single responsibility as a worker is to come in and do my job, to write code or write documentation or fix deployments or whatever. But that abstraction is going to leak. Your work might violate someone's privacy or discriminate against someone for their race or even facilitate a genocide. And that's your responsibility too. Or rather, it's our responsibility because we're building these tools together, and so it's on us to come together to fix the problems with them. So let's talk about some successes. Just in 2020 alone, 2 tech companies have voted to unionize, Kickstarter and Glitch. Kickstarter was significantly more reluctant than Glitch, and they fired 2 of the workers that were involved in organizing, but they were unsuccessful in stopping their union, and their workers voted 46-37 to form a union, so congratulations, Kickstarter, on your union. Yay! Glitch, on the other hand, voluntarily recognized its union when over 90% of employees indicated that they wanted one. So Glitch also has a union now, and again, congratulations to the workers at Glitch. Another victory was won last fall when workers at HCL Technologies, which is a Google contractor in Pittsburgh, voted to join a union. Congrats to HCL workers. There's also been organizing successes outside of union efforts. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Amazon warehouse workers in Chicago, Sacramento, and New York City, a group called Amazonians United, pressured Amazon into finally granting all Amazon workers paid time off. Obviously, that alone is not enough to protect workers, and the struggle is ongoing, but it shows what gains can be won if workers come together. Imagine what we could all accomplish if we joined with them as tech workers. One other victory, which I mentioned back at the beginning of my talk, is that many tech companies force their employees to agree to binding arbitration when they're hired. And a group called Googlers for Ending Forced Arbitration, which arose out of the Google walkout, pushed Google to end forced arbitration. And after a lot of pressure, they agreed. They actually agreed specifically to end it for sexual harassment and discrimination claims. And then the Googlers for Ending Forced Arbitration were like, no, that's not enough. And eventually Google caved and agreed to end it for everything. This is for people employed by Google as well as contractors that are directly employed by Google, but it doesn't currently cover people who contract with companies that Google contracts. So it's not everyone that's covered. So there's still ways to go, but it's a big victory. And there's even a bill that's passed in the House called the Forced Arbitration Injustice Repeal Act, which would prohibit forced arbitration from being required in contracts nationwide, which would be a huge victory. Obviously, we're not going to get too far with the current makeup of Congress, but that's also something to get excited about, and is really being pushed by tech workers. So these are just some successes of the last year or so. There's so much more happening every day that you can be a part of. So how do you learn more and get involved? So the final thing I want to share with all of you is a list of resources and organizations for you to look into. So first off, unions. There are a lot of different unions, and I'm just going to name the ones that have been working most actively with tech workers, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't reach out to other ones. Unions are on your side, and even if you're not sure whether you actually want to organize a union, you're not sure what kind of organizing you want to do, maybe you're not sure if you want to do organizing at all, still reach out. Obviously, they think unions are a great strategy, but they're not going to push you into anything. So anyway, one of the unions that has been most active in tech is CWA, the Communications Workers of America. They have something called the Code Initiative, the campaign to organize digital employees, and they helped Glitch form their union. And they've been helping workers all over the tech and games industry, great people involved, reach out to them. Another union that's been working in tech is the United Steelworkers. So they're the union that organized the workers at HCL, the Google contractor in Pittsburgh. There's also the Office of the Professional Employees International Union, OPEIU, which helped Kickstarter form their union. One organization that is not a union that I do highly recommend checking out is coworker.org. They are a digital platform, or a group that has a digital platform that helps workers connect with each other, and they back that up with an amazing staff of trained organizers who can talk you through your options and support you and your coworkers as you decide what you want to do next. There are also a number of tech worker organizations that you can join or reach out to. There is the Tech Workers Coalition, which is an informal organization with about 15 active chapters across the globe, the majority of which are in the US. I help organize the DC local of TWC, so if you're in the DMV area, please reach out about getting involved with us. There's Game Workers Unite, which is for workers in the game industry. I know less about them because I am not a game worker, but I've met a number of people involved and they're wonderful, so you should join if you're a game worker. There are also a number of groups that are specific to individual companies, such as Googlers for Human Rights and Microsoft Workers for Good and Workers for Workers, which is an organization that's building solidarity between Facebook's full-time employees and its contractors. Here, I'm going to put up a slide. Here's a slide, which is a list of all of the orgs that I could find, but I probably missed some, so if you work at a specific tech company, I recommend explicitly looking for groups like this that are in your company. Finally, I've got a whole list of talks and articles about organizing in tech and organizing in general that you might want to check out. I put them all again on a slide for you. And that's it. Well, not it in the broader sense, but that's it for my talk. I hope that you found it helpful, and if you've got any questions or you want to be connected to some of the people or organizations that I've talked about, please feel free to reach out to me personally. One of the things that I love about the Python community is the way that we support each other. I love coming to PyCon and seeing the Spanish language track and the pronoun ribbons on the conference badges and the real-time transcription of the talks and the meetups for the newcomers and the PyLadies auction to support women in Python. I love going to the Python talks that address mental health and depression and anxiety, that talk about racial and economic inequality in our communities and the importance of valuing all different kinds of work and contributions. And it's in that spirit of PyCon that I have written this talk. I see supporting each other to address problems in our workplaces as yet another way to support each other. Because healthy communities and healthy workplaces help us flourish as individuals. And when we are flourishing as individuals, we can give back to our communities. We don't have to be stuck in an endless cycle of fear and helplessness and apathy and selfishness. We can be part of something so much better, and I think we will be. I almost forgot to record this final section. So I thought that instead of doing a Q&A, because we can't do a Q&A because this is not live, I'm just recording this talk, I do kind of a reverse Q&A where I ask questions. So I went and found a couple of people who've been involved in organizing in tech, and I asked them some questions, and they came up with some interesting answers. So I hope you enjoy.
Okay, so first off, I'm Clarissa Redwine. I helped organize Kickstarter United. The way that I got involved in the union effort at Kickstarter was the way that everyone got involved, which is a simple conversation with a coworker. So Taylor Moore, one of the early organizers of Kickstarter United, called me up one day. I was in San Francisco, he was in New York, and we started talking about the things that we had experienced in our time at Kickstarter. We'd both been there for quite a few years, and we talked about recent events. There was a moment where our team challenged a decision made by management, and we won. We fought for our community's values and we won, but management retaliated against some of the people who had been most vocal in that collective action. So we talked on the phone about how it would be great if we had a structure that could protect against that kind of action taken by management, and just how much knowledge and how much energy our coworkers have to help better Kickstarter and strengthen the community and the platform. So I think I probably told Taylor, like, I need to think about this. But I do remember the next day texting him, I'm in. So that's how I got involved. Someone approached me, we had a conversation about our working conditions, and ultimately I decided to trust my fellow coworkers. Yeah, so that's how I got involved. Um, I did end up joining the outreach effort. So within the union effort, we had different working groups. There was like a communications working group. There was also an outreach working group, and I sort of had a hand in a couple different groups. And for outreach, it's very simple. We would walk around the block or go get coffee, and I would talk to my coworkers about their experience at Kickstarter so far, their experience maybe at other companies, and we would just get to know each other. And usually, a coworker would have an idea for how to improve Kickstarter or to improve our working conditions, and eventually the idea of a union would come up in these conversations, and it was very interesting to see how people reacted when the idea of a union was brought up. Funny enough, some people at first, when they heard the idea of a union, felt like a union would create a relationship with their managers that were not they were not prepared for. So one thing that I love about my colleagues is they did trust management and leadership, and we did work with a lot of people in leadership every day. It's a very small company, maybe 100 people, but when it comes to recognizing the inherent power imbalance in those relationships, some people just didn't want to come to terms with how much power our managers had over our careers and lives. And that was very difficult organizing around, because you definitely don't want to come off as railing against a manager that has a pretty good relationship with your coworker, if that's not going to help them understand that building worker power is going to help them. It really just pushes them away from the union effort. So we spent a lot of time sort of explaining to our colleagues that, yes, you may enjoy your relationship with your manager, but it's very important that we have a contract and protections so that if anything changes, you understand the terms that you're working under. So that took quite a few conversations with people, and some people never came around, and some people did, which was really exciting to see. Some other people were kind of confused about what a union could do and what a union what are the limits of a unionized workforce. Some people thought that why should we organize? We have free avocados in the kitchen. We have an amazing rooftop garden, and having a conversation around what happens when you stand up against a decision that your manager makes. We've seen in the past that there's retaliation. What happens when you experience sexual harassment and the company mismanages it, which we've seen before? It was more talking about what are the unknowns that we want to be prepared for as a community within Kickstarter. So, oh, you know what? I think I skipped over what was the hardest part of approaching other people. So one of the hardest parts of approaching coworkers and talking about the union is, one, you have to be very careful when you're unionizing to make sure that you build trust with the other person. You get to know them first. You know what their issues are, what they're interested in, and you have to make sure that they're not going to run to management and tell management everything you just talked about. And you also have to make sure that you're building the idea of joining a union along with building the idea of having power and agency in your workplace. It's not just about pushing back against management. It's about working with management to create a better working environment in a way where the power structures are healthier. So that was something that was a bit hard to explain. Let's see. Oh gosh, so I I definitely joined the union effort out of solidarity. I was part of a team at Kickstarter, the design and technology outreach team. Um, that team within Kickstarter was usually pretty safe when it came to like organizational shakeups or restructuring or layoffs. Usually that team was intact through all of those changes through Kickstarter's history. So I did feel like I was in a place of like I was safer than other employees and other teams that had historically been treated a little less than vital. So I thought that I could potentially lend my little bit of power to the collective, and together we would be stronger. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to be one of the more public faces of the union, because I thought I was more safe. Which didn't turn out to be the case. But yeah, so let's see. So my hope for building the union was to basically lend power and decision making ability to other teams at Kickstarter who usually didn't have the ability to push back against management decisions, and that's pretty much the only thing that I had in mind when I joined was, if I can make it a little bit easier for someone else, then why not? And then soon after organizing, while I was having outreach conversations, I discovered that I was making 10% less than my male counterpart in a salary transparency swap. And I started to realize that a system that takes advantage of the person next to me is probably taking advantage of me as well, which I sort of knew on an intellectual level, but I didn't feel it in this like visceral way before until I had that like gut punch of realizing that I was experiencing pay inequity. So my hopes for the union turned from supporting other people who were in unfair situations to also supporting. I was advocating for myself as well, and I think that's an important part of organizing, is to recognize that yes, you're fighting for the person next to you, but you're also fighting for yourself, and that's an important thing, and we shouldn't shy away from voicing that. Let's see. A fear when it came to organizing. We had a lot of fears. A lot of people were afraid to be internally public in any way or be associated with union efforts, because they knew that there was a good chance that management would retaliate. We were also afraid that that this would set us back if we couldn't organize, or if management decided to fire or push out a lot of people in the union. We were afraid that we would not be able to make it to a vote, or if we made it to a vote and lost, we would have to wait another year to organize. And a year in tech, there's a lot of turnover that happens that year. So racing against the clock was a big issue and a big fear for people. One of the biggest fears that we should have had that we did not have at the beginning, we didn't really think that Kickstarter's management would be as anti-union as they were. We thought that if we brought the idea of recognizing a union to Kickstarter's leadership, that they would be excited to be part of this the forefront of ethical tech, and they would be excited to live their public benefit corporation values and support us as coworkers. And it was a big surprise that they did everything in the book to be anti-union. So that was a big surprise, and we should have been more fearful of that than we were. And that's a big part of hindsight. So even if your company, displays values that you agree with and is forward thinking and caring about their community, the community that they serve, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to break out of their incentive structures that keep unfair working conditions in place. Yeah, and oh gosh, the kind of support that I think we could have used. So we got support from all different kinds of people. So people who had built unions in the past, people who maybe were part of tech organizing efforts, in other ways. But one thing that we could have used is more inoculation when it came to protecting our core organizers. We as organizers did a pretty good job of inoculating our coworkers, but I don't think we did a great job of setting ourselves up so that we were bulletproof when management came after us, partly because we didn't think that management would go after us in such a blatant way. I had exceeded all of my metrics. Taylor had also exceeded the metrics that they had given him after they put him on a performance improvement plan, which he didn't, I don't think he deserved. If we had had more instruction at the beginning of how to create a paper trail that reinforced our good work, that would have helped us at the end, and maybe even kept us from getting fired in the way that we were fired. So that might have been good proactive support that we could have used, is sort of how to legally protect yourself as you're becoming more and more of a visible union figure. I was lucky enough, along that thought process, I was lucky enough to have a lot of documentation about my work and about how management was targeting me. But, and please don't judge me, but the reason that I had so much documentation is because I was earnestly trying to get help from HR and my manager, and I was saying like, hey, I think this feedback is not appropriate. I think this is targeting. I think this is retaliation. And what I was actually doing was like sharpening, the machine that they were employing to get rid of us. So that understanding also like would have been good to have, external HR support. Maybe from our union, I guess. OPIU did a lot of work there to help support us and to help us navigate what was happening to us, but there were core elements of building a wrongful termination case that we found out when we were actually having our interviews with the NLRB. It would have been nice to know that, management must know that you're part of the union. You must prove that you were being treated differently from other people, and you must prove that there were negative consequences after management found out that you were part of the union. Those like core parts of proving your case would have been really nice to know at the very start of when we decided to put ourselves out there. So that kind of support probably would have been helpful, but we just really didn't think Kickstarter was going to do that kind of thing. So so hindsight. Changed since we started organizing? Well, we maybe 2 weeks after we think management became aware of the organizing effort through a leak, we think that about 2 weeks after we had an all hands, and something that we had asked for a long time and that we were organizing around was an anonymous reporting tool. And Kickstarter had the head of HR sent around a note saying that they were doing away with the anonymous reporting tool and they wouldn't be replacing it. And several of us sent all-out emails asking for it to be replaced, and we were turned down every time. And this was over the course of maybe 6 months. And 2 weeks after management found out that staff was talking about unionizing, they immediately instituted a new anonymous reporting tool, and they had an all hands where a portion of the all hands was dedicated to financial transparency. And they talked about how they were reworking how we got promotions and how we anyway, so it became very apparent that management was trying to improve our workplaces pretty immediately after they found out that we had been organizing as a group. What we didn't realize was that this was part of a larger strategy to undermine the union and to basically union bust. We originally thought, oh my gosh, what great evidence that unionizing and that acting as a collective can make positive change in our workplace. But we probably should have seen that as more of an insidious act to undermine the union. So, the vote was so exciting. Taylor and I actually got to participate in the vote, and we walked right into Kickstarter HQ, cast our vote. It was amazing. And our fellow organizers actually swarmed us so that we had this buffer of coworkers going into the walls of Kickstarter, because it was quite nerve-wracking, at least for me. Taylor seemed fine. The election was amazing. And so the first thing that happens after you win a union is you have a meeting with the yes and the no votes. And when you have a union election, almost everyone votes. It's very unusual for people not to vote in a union election. There's very high turnout. So you have this meeting where you come together and you're like, hey, we're a team. Let's build this union together. So that happened a couple of weeks ago, or months ago now. The coronavirus is squishing time. But so everyone came together in a meeting and are talking about what they want in their contract, and they're beginning discussions with Kickstarter's management. So that's what's happening now. And on the NLRB front, Taylor and I are still waiting for our case to be decided. It's highly unusual for a case to have lasted this long in the system if there wasn't merit to the unlawful termination charge. So we're just waiting to hear what's happening with that. And at the same time, waiting to see what's going on at Kickstarter and see what kind of contract they win. So that's about it.